In this video, we're going to talk about the erythrocytes, which are also commonly known as your red blood cells. These are the most abundant formed element in the blood, and they're going to play a very important role in helping to transport oxygen throughout the body. So these red blood cells are going to pick up oxygen from the lungs and help carry that oxygen to our tissues and cells. They're also going to pick up some carbon dioxide from those cells to deliver back to the lungs, but it's going to be a very small amount compared to what the blood plasma will be carrying. So we know that erythrocytes are obviously going to be extremely important component of the blood, and if you were to lose too many of these, that could be fatal within just a few short minutes. So once again, these are the most abundant formed element in the blood, and when we are looking at the number of red blood cells in the blood, what we're looking at is the hematocrit within that blood. So if you have your hematocrit measured, they're basically just looking at the percentage of red blood cells within your blood volume. This typically tends to be a little bit higher in men, and that could be caused by a couple of things. Androgens, which are male hormones, tend to stimulate more production of red blood cells, and you also have females losing red blood cells during menstruation every month. So that can affect that hematocrit level just a little bit throughout the month. Looking at the structure, what these red blood cells look like, these are biconcave disc, which means they're kind of caved in the middle and they're a little bit thicker around the edges. You'll notice that these cells do not have a nucleus. They have no organelles. They're basically just little sacs of hemoglobin. So there are little proteins inside of the cells called hemoglobin. And we'll talk about what those look like in a second, but for now, just know that those hemoglobin molecules are used to bind to oxygen units and help to transport that oxygen through the body. So you'll notice that since we don't have a nucleus and since there are no organelles, this cell is going to be very flimsy, it's going to be very flexible, and the way that it's shaped makes it very easy for these cells to kind of move in and out of blood vessels very easily and not get stuck or form clots that are unwanted within the blood vessels. So as I mentioned before, these erythrocytes are going to contain tons of these hemoglobin molecules, and hemoglobin molecules contain iron. Iron is what causes those red blood cells to look red in color, and so each one of those hemoglobin molecules has two alpha chains, or each globin has two alpha chains and two beta chains within it, and then each hemoglobin also has a non-protein component called a heme group. And in that heme group is where you will find these iron subunits. So you'll notice there are 4 heme groups in one hemoglobin molecule, and each one of these heme groups has an iron in the center of it, and this is where the oxygen will bind. It will actually bind to that heme group. So each hemoglobin molecule can hold 4 oxygen subunits, and I believe there are around 250 million hemoglobin molecules in just around 1 drop of blood, so that gives you about 1 billion molecules of oxygen in one little tiny drop of blood, which is pretty impressive as far as being able to transport that much oxygen in such a small amount of fluid. Now, hemoglobin can also bind to carbon dioxide waste and transport it, but it's only going to carry about 5% of that carbon dioxide waste. Pretty much all of the rest of that waste will be transported in the plasma instead. Looking at some disorders of the erythrocyte, sickle cell disease is one of the most common types of disorders that you see with red blood cells, especially in the African American population. People who are of African descent have a lot higher probability of having sickle cell or being a carrier for sickle cell disease. And there is a hypothesis that the reason for that is because people who have sickle cell or who carry the trait for sickle cell tend to have some resistance to the malaria parasite. Malaria is there's a parasite that causes it, that gets into your red blood cells, causes those red blood cells to lyse, and that's very dangerous because it starts killing all your red blood cells and they no longer can transport oxygen for you. So when you have sickle cell, or when you're a carrier of sickle cell, if you have a defective gene for the production of hemoglobin, that can prevent the malaria parasite from being able to get into your red blood cells effectively, and so it would essentially give you an immunity to malaria, which would be beneficial for someone who lives in Africa who is exposed to malaria at a much higher rate than someone who lived in America, for instance. Now, in sickle cell, even though it could provide immunity to malaria, we know that it can still cause a lot of problems, because with sickle cell, essentially what happens is your hemoglobin molecules do not form in the correct shape, and so that causes the red blood cells as a whole to become more sickle shaped, like this picture that you're looking at here. And when they have this sickle shape, it makes them more prone to stick together and to form clots in the vessels. It also makes it more difficult for those cells to be able to move freely through the blood vessels, and so that can lead to problems with blood clotting, which would prevent you from being able to get good blood flow to certain parts of the body. That can cause a lot of pain. If you start forming clots in the heart, it could cause heart attacks. If you start forming clots in the brain, it could lead to a stroke. And so none of those things are going to be good. They can cause lots of problems. And if the sickle cell is severe enough, it could be deadly, especially if it goes untreated. So untreated sickle cell could, kill an individual very easily within a couple of years. If you have treatment, typically you have a much longer lifespan, especially if you're in a developed country with good technology and good medications for this. But you can still see a lot of issues that kind of go along with sickle cell. And so there are new treatments that they're constantly working on, trying to come up with a cure for this. But as of right now, treatment is really just the best option that we have. As far as the life cycle of erythrocytes, they last for about 120 days. Remember, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have organelles, so they're not going to be able to live forever. They're going to deliver oxygen for about 120 days, and then they're going to start to die off and kind of fall apart. And at that point, your spleen will essentially filter out those dead cells, break down all of those old red blood cells, and then recycle the materials from those red blood cells to use again later. And we also know that we're constantly going to have to be replacing those red blood cells that are dying. And we can do that through the use of hematopoietic stem cells, which are found in our bone marrow. So pretty much all the stem cells for your blood are going to be located in the bone marrow. Those stem cells will develop into cells called colony-forming units, and then those can eventually mature into other types of blood cells, including these erythrocytes that we're talking about. So again, you start out with this hematopoietic stem cell in the blood marrow or the bone marrow. Those differentiate into erythrocyte colony-forming units, which can then differentiate into immature erythrocytes called erythroblasts. At this point, the nuclei will start to kind of die off, the organelles start dying off and disintegrating, and eventually you end up with these biconcave erythrocytes, which have no nucleus or organelles and are slam-packed with those hemoglobin units that are used to transport oxygen. So again, about 120 days, that's about how long these erythrocytes will last before they're broken down by the spleen, and we are constantly replacing these old, worn-out erythrocytes. We're going to be recycling the subunits from those erythrocytes, like the globin and the iron. We're going to reuse those when we can. As far as the heme, the rest of the heme, when it gets broken down, it gets converted into a pigment, which we call bilirubin. Now, in healthy individuals, your liver will remove that bilirubin from your blood and basically excrete it into your bile, which is part of the digestive tract. The bile gets stored in the gallbladder, and as you're digesting food, the bile gets secreted into the small intestine to help digest fats. That also helps give feces its brown color. Now, if that bilirubin does not get removed from the blood by your liver, for whatever reason, it can accumulate in the blood and it can cause yellowing of the skin. You can also see this yellowing in the sclera of the eye, the whites of the eye. This is a very common thing to happen in newborn infants because their liver is not fully formed yet, it's not very mature yet, and it doesn't do a very good job of removing all of that bilirubin from the blood. And so you might see some jaundice in newborn babies until their liver starts fully maturing, and then it can kind of level out. You will also see jaundice in people who have liver disease or going through liver failure because their liver, again, cannot filter out that bilirubin. All right, so you guys look at this erythrocyte video. As you're going through this part of the PowerPoint, if you have any questions, just reach out to me and let me know. I'll see you guys for the next video.